Earth and its Inhabitants, Great Britain, Volume 4, part of Europe. The British Seas. To the seas which surround them, the British Islands are indebted for the mildness of their climate, their security from foreign invasion, their commerce, and the wealth yielded by productive fisheries. These seas are shallow. If the waters were to subside to the extent of 300 feet, the whole of the British Islands, including Ireland, would once more be united to continental Europe. A subsidence of little more than 100 feet would result in the formation of an isthmus connecting Lincolnshire with Holland. The line drawn on a map to mark a depth of 600 feet passes about 60 miles to the west of Ireland, Outer Hebrides, and Shetland. All within that line is less considerable in depth, excepting only a few pits, depressions in the bed of the sea, which lie off the west coast of Scotland and in the North Channel. The North Sea, or German Ocean, to the south of the parallel of Aberdeen, hardly anywhere exceeds a depth of 300 feet, and it grows shallower towards the south. It is exceedingly rich in fish, and Mobius very justly remarks that its bed is far more profitable to man than are the sterile heaths which border its shores. Its fisheries give employment to about 900 fishing smacks, of which 650 sail under the English flag, and the harvest of fish annually drawn from its depths has been estimated at 75,000 tons. One of its most productive fishing grounds is the Dodger Bank, which occupies its center and supplies London and other large towns with immense quantities of cod. The North Sea is indebted for its wealth in fish to its shallowness and freedom from rocks. Oyster beds are the only obstacles which the dredge of the fishermen occasionally encounters. These oysters of the high sea, however, are but little esteemed. The best oysters are found in the shallow, brackish waters along the English coast. It is these which are deposited in the oyster parks of Austin to be fattened. In its general features, the bed of the North Sea resembles the mud flats, or Aden, of its eastern shore. Oceanic currents have scooped out channels in the mud and sand, but the original relief of the seabed has been obliterated. A submarine plain like this can be the product only of causes acting uniformly over a wide area, and for such cause the majority of geologists go back to the glacial epoch, when glaciers laden with the waste of the land drifted into this ancient Gulf of the Atlantic and there deposited their loads. Even at the present day, there are agencies at work which tend to fill up the basin of the North Sea. Glaciers are no longer stranded on its shores, but rivers deposit in the sediment which they are charged, whilst the Arctic current, which makes itself feebly felt in its vast gulf, conveys into it pumice stone ejected from the volcanoes of Iceland and Jan Mayen. Deposition is consequently still going on, though at a much slower rate than formerly. But how are we to explain the gradual filling up of the North Sea, whilst the abysmal channel which separates it from Norway retains its depths hundreds of fathoms? Is it not that its very depth saved it from becoming the depository of glacial drift? The glaciers, carried southward by currents and northerly winds, may be supposed to have stranded only after they had reached the shallower waters of the North Sea, when melting under the influence of the sun, they deposit upon its bottom the debris they carried. The Strait of Dover, which joins the North Sea to the English Channel, has a width of only 20 miles, and in depth nowhere exceeds 180 feet. The navigation is not without danger, owing to conflicting currents and the sandbanks which cumber the approaches. The most famous of these banks are the Goodwins, off the coast of Kent, within which lies the roadstead called the Downs, a great resort of vessels waiting for favorable winds and tides. The English Channel gradually increases in depth as we proceed to the westward until off Land's End. It exceeds 300 feet. The Irish Sea is far more considerable in depth than the German Ocean, and Ireland was an island lying off the coast of Western Europe long before Great Britain had been severed from the neighboring continent. Yet, compared with the open Atlantic, or even with inland seas and volcanic regions, its depth is inconsiderable. Only detached portions of its bed sink below 300 feet, and the maximum depth does not exceed 500 feet. In the North Channel, however, the depth is greater, being nowhere less than 300 feet and attaining 664 feet in one of the pits lying midway between Galloway and the Low of Belfast. The tidal undulation reaches the British Island from the southwest and traveling along the west coast of Ireland and Scotland, wheels completely around the north of the island so that the old tide coming from the northward down the German Ocean meets the Atlantic tide of 12 hours later, date opposite to the mouth of the Thames. Similarly, opposite tidal currents penetrate into the Irish Sea from the north and south, meeting about the parallel of the Isle of Man. The rise of the tide is generally greater on the exposed west coast than on either the south or east coast, but varies exceedingly according to local circumstances. Where tidal waves meet, a higher rise is the result, but where the time at which a high tide wave reaches a particular coast coincides with the movement of ebb of a tidal wave coming from another direction, the two undulations neutralize each other. Thus, on the southeast coast of Ireland and at Portland Hill in the English Channel, the two undulations almost balance each other, and the tide is consequently hardly perceptible. On the contrary, when the tidal wave enters a narrowing arm of the sea or an estuary, it advances with increasing impetuosity and attains a considerable height. The most conspicuous instance of this is presented by the Bristol Channel, which becomes shallower as it narrows, and where the spring tides consequently attain a height of 60 feet. The general rise of the tides, however, is far less.